Welcome to CityMakers Voices, presented by the Wholesome Foundation. In this series, we sit down with the top minds shaping the urban environment. Our third episode is with Brogan MacDonald, structural engineer and head of sustainability at Ramboll UK's Building Structures division. She sits down with our host, journalist Nolan Giles, at the 2025 Wholesome Foundation Forum in Venice. Here, they discuss the construction industry's waste problem, the rise of refurbishment, and best practice in treating cities as urban mines. They start the interview by discussing the construction challenges facing London, the UK capital.
I live in London. Obviously, there's a lot of construction going on all the time there. There's a lot of legacy infrastructure. If I was to ask you what sustainable construction in London looks like, how would you respond?
I think it's a really important question because London's already a very dense city. So actually, sustainable construction in London is reusing the existing buildings and assets we currently have. So 60% of the waste in the UK comes from construction and demolition waste. That's an extreme amount and quantity there. We have a very extractive and wasteful economy, and actually the value of those materials are not fully utilised and understood. So what we really need to do now is actually reuse the existing buildings in their current form, but then reuse the materials too.
It's interesting because I think big picture, if I was to think about London and talk about like architectural excellence, I would point people to, if someone asked me, I would point them to things like the Tate Modern, now the Battersea Power Station. So there are excellent examples of reuse in that city, but maybe I'm just seeing the brighter side of the story. You're saying, what was the percentage of waste coming
60%.
out? 60%.
Yeah.
That's absolutely, that's completely unsustainable, right? So can we maybe zone in on that 60% of waste, where it's coming from and how we can better manage it?
Yeah, it's coming from lots of materials. So concrete is a really typical example. So concrete's very hard to deconstruct. There has been case studies in the past, but it's a real hard material to deconstruct. Steel, for example, steel beams, columns, that is being deconstructed and reused in the UK. We've got amazing case studies in London. We've got a project that we're working on in central London and Broadgate, where we've reused the existing steel frame building and put it into the new one. The cost of deconstructing buildings, because of our labour costs, is so great in Western Europe. There's no incentivisations currently to deconstruct a building or reuse materials, and then there's no tax carbon penalty on new materials. So we're kind of stuck in this loop that until something changes in the policy landscape, that we won't move ahead of reusing more and more materials. And it's currently only developers with really strong mission statements and ESG that are making those moves.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad reality that in somewhere like Europe, there is such a strong conversation among, I guess, more creative professionals as well, in terms of architects and engineers, but policy just doesn't seem to catch up in time, even though it is moving, I would say, in the right direction. Yeah. So I guess what's your role in kind of advancing policy, in informing developers, like really kind of getting that message across, because it's not an easy message because there's money's involved, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's many things that we can do. For me, I work at the intersection of a lot of these landscapes within architects, within developers, talking to insurers, funders, investors, the whole value chain. I see my role is bridging the gap between them because we all have different language. In my engineering role, I have engineering language, but I don't sit in that space so much now. And I'm really trying to bridge between investors, insurers, and insurers are specifically important because we are facing these extreme risks of climate resilience, flooding, overheating, etc. But also insurers because we need to innovate new materials. We need to change the kind of materials that we use to more bio-based and natural materials and innovative concrete. And insurers need to be able to insure those. And the UK is a little bit conservative and we get really nervous about novel materials because of historic events. And that's okay, but we have to, as built environment professionals, give them the technical assurance that they work. So there's many initiatives going on in terms of policy. There's the Part Z, which is an amendment to the building regulations, a proposed amendment that would limit embodied carbon. That has already been enacted in many countries, in Denmark and France, for example. And what that's resulted in is you can't build new flashy buildings. That you have to reuse existing buildings, or when you do build new, it has to be the state-of-the-art low carbon materials. there's loads of, I would say, bottom-up approaches happening in the absence of policy in the UK. Industry groups like Architects Climate Action Network, ACAN, Architects Declare, I sit on the steering group of Structural Engineers Declare, and we're all making efforts to change industry from the bottom up.
So interesting. But for an outsider like me, it really sounds like there's literally no one-size-fits-all approach. You can't just say, this is the material of the future and it's going to define infrastructure in our cities. There are probably many materials of the future. And like you say, it's hard to get them kind of into that equation legally. Are there any particular aspects of this value chain that you're really seeing like, we can make an impact? Even in the last, say, 5 years, you're seeing things moving more quickly than perhaps other parts of the value chain. Like, where do you see the most hope?
I see the most hope in refurbishing buildings, because one, it not always, but it can reduce cost. It really depends on the complexity of the existing building and its constraints. It can reduce cost. You've got an existing asset there already. Refurbishing it completely makes sense. The challenges, again, exist where there's really challenging constraints on the site. It might require more coordination. It's technically trickier. In my opinion, I think that's so much more fun than building a new building. But there's been much more refurbishment, reuse being talked about in the real estate sector. And then from a carbon point of view, from a general sustainability point of view, you're using less resources. So when it comes down to companies' ESG reporting, they can say that they've reduced the amount of resources, they've supported social value, local supply chains, etc. So I think I've observed in the last 18 months specifically, a big growth for the refurbishment and reuse space, even to the point where many designers now are trying to target that for their projects, for their KPIs. They want, let's say, 30% of their portfolio to be in the refurbishment and reuse space.
And does that stock exist in London? Is it possible to make more with what we already have?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're sitting on urban mines, essentially. These buildings are full of excellent materials. Like I said, the challenge we face is getting the numbers to stack up, because at the moment it's basically the greater good that are doing this, knowing that it's the right thing, because there's no incentive. There's no incentive. And how sad that is, that we need an incentive to reuse materials. Like if we go back to pre-industrial, there wasn't such a thing of throwing things away. We had to use things we already had. And many countries in the global south, they actually demolish buildings for free because the value of those materials is so great and the labor is so cheap. We need to kind of go back to our, I was going to say indigenous wisdom, but maybe not indigenous, but like we need to go back to times before and understand, the way that we built actually was very sustainable. And it's just that through evolution and capitalism, that's how we've evolved.
So to simplify it for me, like you said before, the materials are, I guess, too cheap and too readily available. Yeah. And I mean, fashion is a weird kind of analogy to make, but I think people who think about their wardrobe in a sustainable and conscious way, they will buy, one pair of boots that will last them for 10 years. It's how we used to live back in the day. And now we're in this space where there's just abundance, right? Yeah. To be honest, you're one of the first people who's kind of made this very clear to me in terms of articulating it. But like, who's having that conversation right now, saying like the building sector just has it too easy in terms of bad materials?
Yeah, it's a funny one, because there's a much greater public consciousness and awareness of flying. People know that that's bad. People know that fast fashion is bad. People are aware of that. When it comes to the built environment, for some reason, there isn't that same kind of rooted understanding that cement emissions are 8% of global emissions. That's triple aviation. So when people feel guilty about flying, do they feel guilty about putting concrete in the foundations of their house? No. So it's really interesting. Like, I'm passionate about making that much more accessible to people, and understanding that actually building new buildings is actually extremely damaging. But also the people who are building those buildings are not getting the same pressure from the public. There's been many campaigns about saving buildings and demolition. Many are not fit for purpose, but not fit for what? These buildings, unless they're structurally unsafe, should not be demolished. They can always find a reuse. Maybe it's not the economic reuse they want of a flashy commercial office building, but maybe it works for a hotel, or maybe it works for student residential. Maybe it works for a shopping centre.
Exactly, yeah.
But that's the challenge we face now.
In terms of reuse projects in a city like London. You don't have to pick a place from London, but this education piece that you're talking about, because I think you're right in that the general public is pretty well informed these days about carbon emissions and how they're impacting the planet, but they're truly uninformed about the built environment.
Yeah.
So where should they look to in terms of like best in class developments in UK or in Europe where it's just worked for everyone?
Yeah.
Does it exist?
Oh, it doesn't exist. It's a very standard question of like, what is the most sustainable building? The standard phrase is this: the most sustainable building is the one not built. But there are exceptional examples. One of my favorite ones is Quay Quarter in Sydney by an architect called 3XN. And they reused a skyscraper, essentially, and completely cut and carved it to be something spectacular. So they've reused a fantastic form of architecture and turned into something much better that worked for the building, worked for the client, but also is just like exceptional. And they've reused lots of the building materials. There are many other examples out there like that. I worked on a project in London for many years where it was an existing 1950s concrete frame. It was a hotel. The client didn't care so much about keeping it. And they were like, oh, we can demolish it and start again. But we actually came up with a strategy to retain that building. And instead of starting again, they wanted to add more area. So we extended on top, we extended to the side, and we actually extended below the building. So we extruded it in every direction. And the reason we extended below the building is in London, we have a lot of planning requirements on building height because of views of St. Paul's Cathedral. So when we couldn't build up to a certain height, we went underneath. And we jacked up the whole building and extended the basement. Now, I'm not really for basement construction because it has many other ecological impacts. However, in that case, through retaining that building, we saved 5,000 tons of demolition waste and 3,500 tons of carbon. So there was a really good story there, but it's not perfect.
Where is the building so people
It's
know?
in Mayfair.
Okay, and what's it called?
I can't say.
Oh, okay, secret project.
But there's many other projects that exist like that as well. There's incredible refurbishments happening in London and many other dense cities. Unfortunately, they're not seen so much to the public because they're behind these hoarding for years and they're unveiled. And it might look the same from the outside, but actually what's happened inside is incredible.
It's not the sexiest sell, is it?
No.
Okay, so we're looking at opportunities, and I think you've outlined some pretty strong opportunities already, but if you were to kind of sum up what people in the world of city making can really aspire to in terms of opportunities, what would you point out?
I think the opportunities are there within the existing materials and typologies that we have. So rather than viewing existing buildings as challenges and constraints, viewing them as basically material banks and urban mining, how can we reuse those buildings in their current form or reuse them as an inventory? I like using the phrase inventory constrained design. So in the design community, how can we design from a list of stuff? A kit of parts, an IKEA catalogue, let's say. You're given that catalogue and you have to build with what you have. And really that's how we have to design now. We don't have an abundance of materials, regardless of how we consume in the global north. We have a very, very limited amount. And not only does extracting these materials cause carbon emissions, it causes severe biodiversity loss. And we're now starting to try and figure out and quantify what the biodiversity loss is from quarries and mining iron to be used in steel. So actually, I think the biggest opportunity is reusing those existing materials that we have, but also making that a design challenge.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank you to our guest, Brogan MacDonald, for joining us on this episode of CityMakers Voices. CityMakers Voices is brought to you by the Wholesome Foundation. It was produced by Nolan Giles and edited by Paige Reynolds, with additional production from Andrea Pugiotto. Thanks for listening. The Wholesome Foundation is a non-profit organisation supporting CityMakers as change accelerators for sustainable construction. Find out more at wholesomefoundation.org.